Whispering Woods and Genevieve Joyce are welcoming a strange assortment of animals from all over the world thanks to the rescue efforts of various organizations and the connections of Imogen Chen and Anna Kingston. These animals have two things in common. One, they all live in dry, arid environments, and two, they have been displaced from their natural habitats because of SylvaCorp International, a greedy global corporation. Led by Sylvester Kane, a power and money-hungry man, he has no plans of stopping the various oil drilling, forest cutting, and overfishing practices of his company. Thankfully, there are people all over the world willing to help these displaced animals, including Omari Achebe, who is currently working in Namibia's wildlife shelter after volunteering with the Lemur Lifeline. On the other side of the world, Anna Kingston's close friend, Jimena Alvarez, leads a protest group against SylvaCorp in South America, placing heavy emphasis on the harm the company is doing to the environment. The zoo has some big decisions to make. Welcome back to Whispering Woods, Wildlife Haven. Hey everyone, Sparrow here. Today we're breaking ground on the Desert House, which is going to be a massive build right behind the Wallaby Way we built last time. So sit back, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and consider joining the nest. This building will be divided into 3 main sections and also feature 2 outdoor enclosures, which we'll get to next time. This video will focus entirely on the house interior and we'll get around to the exterior in the future. For now, I'm setting up some interior plaster walls for the South American part of the house. All of the enclosures in here are relatively small. They're just large enough for the animals I plan to keep, with some wiggle room for breeding of some species. In this corner, we will have a single armadillo, which is this front habitat I'm working on first, and right behind will be a group of collared peccaries. So that enclosure needs to be quite a bit bigger because they like living in some reasonably sized groups. I will once again be using a mix of the in-game barriers and some custom barriers, though I did have to change up my plans with this enclosure once we started putting enrichment items in. More on that in a bit. Let's focus on sightlines first. The idea behind the Desert House is that you can see how animals may interact in the wild or see the relations between them in terms of their natural habitat. Here, the only separation between the armadillo and the peccaries is going to be a rocky outcrop with a short fence on top. Since the peccary habitat is raised, guests will potentially see both the armadillo and the peccary in a single look. With the armadillo in its habitat, let's focus on terrain painting and traversable area. For sandy habitats like this, I like to use lots of faux rocks and sink them into the ground. For small animals like the armadillo, you just have to be careful that they can walk over the rocks without any issues. Plants, same thing. The ones I'm putting down first are not traversable and have decently sized hitboxes. But once I'm happy with the placement of most of it, we'll move on to the other details. Here come the custom barriers. This is a simple glass, metal post, and bracket attachment build, but it was necessary because in order to get the forage enrichment in for the armadillo, the in-game barriers stopped working. The null barriers, however, still do, so we just need to line the enclosure with our custom barriers to keep the armadillo in. Just like that, it's 1 enclosure down and only 5 more to go. Using a mix of the desert and savanna rocks to add additional color, seeing as much of this house is going to be very, well, deserty and beige. The peccary enclosure slopes down towards the guests on this side, which means I'm placing the buffalo grass pieces individually instead of using my group and sink trick. But I think that will make for a much more natural looking enclosure. Peccaries likely wouldn't have this much vegetation in their enclosure, but I find it looks really bland in Planet Zoo even with the hundreds of faux rocks I've spammed in here. Finishing up their habitat with some enrichment items that will also be beige, and then we're moving on to the fence, which I've decided to line with some plaster at the bottom to make sure nothing is digging its way in or out of the enclosures. It's also just a nice finishing touch on the guest side of things. Speaking of guests, let's move on to the flooring. Since this is a house, I'm putting together a custom floor with a plaster piece underneath and some concrete tiles on top. Once I'm happy with the first piece, we'll fill out the entire Desert House interior and then we won't have to worry about what the paths look like underneath. While construction continues, I have some exciting news coming from the Orchid City Zoo Association, so let's fly over to the beaver habitat. Another zoo in the association, Kingpin's Keystone Park, has had beaver twins. While Bobby will be making his home at Keystone Park, Cadbury is joining our group here at Whispering Woods. Our amazing staff have been entrusted with Cadbury's care due to the amazing work they did with the binturongs from Kingpin's Orchid City Zoo, and we couldn't be happier to have this working professional relationship. On the opposite side of the desert house, I'll be working on a habitat that has 3 tiers and actually houses 3 different species. None of these 3 species really live in the same area of Africa, but their environments are quite similar. This first section will have a small educational outpost within this half circle, which I'm building using the circle trick. And then we'll build out the ground level enclosure for the African spurred tortoise. I haven't built for this species yet, as they were part of the new Zookeeper's animal pack, and they definitely won't be the only species from that pack in today's build. As you can see, some of the custom floor is edging its way into the enclosure, but since tortoises can't jump over fences, we're just going to raise the terrain a bit to hide the imperfections. That, along with our plaster lining, should keep things nice and cohesive. Behind the tortoises, I'm raising the terrain to match the level of the rocks. The animals are hidden in their boxes. See if you can guess which animal this will be. Hopefully the guests will be able to see these small guys just above the tortoises when viewing from the ground level. The final tier needs a slightly taller fence, so I have the steel mesh here, and let's check some traversable terrain to make sure our animals can't get out. If you guessed the Kirk's Dik-Dik for the middle level, you were correct. Unfortunately, these animals may be tiny, but they are apparently escape artists because I spent way too much time making sure they couldn't get out. So here's attempt number 1 with some non-traversable foliage. Didn't quite work. The in-game fences were blocking the view if they were any taller, so I decided on a custom wire fence that just uses a marquee beam, hinges, and cable pieces. This will obstruct the guest view far less, and it does help to keep the antelopes in a bit better, but not well enough. Some more foliage helped, but in the end I reverted to the elephant grass trick and just hid it underground so that the animals couldn't get to that section of the enclosure. Unfortunately for me, apparently the elephant grass hitbox also allows animals to stand on top of it in certain cases, which means the Dik-Diks actually had an easier time getting out. Here's our escape artist now. But hey, the view is pretty nice. As you can see here, this is what the elephant grass hitbox is allowing the animals to do. So I finally took the advice of Simply Zoological, who was listening to me rage about the animals escaping, and lowered the terrain in that one spot. And that seemed to finally fix the problem. Using our good old moving the barrier out of the way trick to get this animal burrow right into the rocks, the African spurred tortoise will have a much sandier habitat with lots of desert plants like the aloe, century plants, and candelabra tree. They have a terrible tolerance for plants, but we're just going to ignore that and continue adding the retusa bushes and drin grass to really fill out the enclosure. And of course, rocks, because no enclosure is complete without them. With how much time we spent making sure the Dik-Diks don't escape, their habitat is pretty much done, so let's move on to the final tier and make ourselves a plant palette. Since this level will be quite close to the ceiling, we'll once again need lots of the lower growing plants and also smaller trees to add some height. The fennec foxes that will be kept up here don't require a lot of foliage, but as with all of the other habitats so far, we'll be going past their requirements but staying in their biome. This Sudanese tree is super pretty and will go right next to this one-way glass where guests can sometimes see the fennec foxes up closer. Before we move to the final part of our build today, I wanted to take a moment to look at the conservation work Whispering Woods has been doing in the background. And that means lots of baby animals. Predator Ridge has so far released 5 wolves and 2 lynx back into the wild, which is a massive success for our zoo. Interestingly, herbivores are actually more at risk than carnivores, with 25% of herbivore species listed as threatened versus 15% of carnivores. While our deer aren't part of this sample, it's still nice to know that we are giving them a safe place to rehabilitate before going back to their natural habitat. Our recent breeding program is off to a great start, with 8 released to the wild so far. And over in Little Asia, we've rehabilitated 2 Markhor, 3 Pallas's cats, and even have our first otter pup. Even our new lemurs have been busy, and this little one is absolutely adorable. And while not all animals need to be released back to the wild, it's still good to know that Whispering Woods is giving them a home, whether temporarily or forever. Thanks for your support. Now let's get back to the build. For the final enclosure of the desert house, we're actually starting off with an exhibit box. The sacred scarab beetle will make its home here, and to hide the box, I'm stacking a bunch of these cladding pieces all around it to blend it into the surrounding area. Once again, mixing the desert and savanna rocks just to keep everything the same in this building. To make the exhibit box appear smaller, we'll put some twilight wood pieces about halfway through and raise them up to create a space that's about 1 meter tall, as opposed to the 4 meters the exhibit box actually takes up. Once I've covered up the rest of it, I'm putting together some lamps to put in there. The beetles don't need a heat lamp like a reptile would, but I thought it was a fun detail. This is my standard way of putting these custom lamps together, so if you haven't seen it before, it's just a conservation bulb, the ceiling rose, and a North African plate piece. I'll throw some of those in the exhibit to get some detail going, and then we'll hop over to this rock where you'll get a preview of what animal you might find in this enclosure. On top of the exhibit box, I'm flipping over some Retusa bushes. This is a great way to cover up rocks and create a faux trailing plant, and I'll absolutely be using this more often in the future. You can probably see a mostly completed enclosure in the background there, just more of the same rock and foliage placement as the other enclosures. So let's get past that and take a quick walk through our desert house. First up, we have South America with our armadillo and collared peccaries. I decided on an Atacama Desert backdrop for this enclosure, and you'll notice that each enclosure has a different background. I love the way this turned out with the cacti and desert foliage, and I hope all of the animals will be super happy here. Next up, we'll walk across to the African tears where we get to come super close to the African spurred tortoise. You might be able to see the dik-diks darting around behind them from this viewing area. A small education space with this adorable tortoise statue by Novska, link in the description, and then let's get a keeper's view of the fennec foxes, who love to hang out in front of their sun mural. Thanks to everyone who gave feedback on this backdrop, the sunset really fits the theme here. And last but certainly not least, we have our African crested porcupine, who loves romping around his enclosure alongside the meerkats. They have plenty of vantage points in their rocky habitat, but don't worry, they're perfectly safe here at the Haven. Remember to subscribe and hit the bell icon if you would like to be notified of the continuation of the Desert House, and consider joining to help me make decisions about the future of Whispering Woods. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.